Hi, I'm Ellen Besner, and this is the CJN Daily, and it's actually episode 3 for the CJN Daily's Dead Beat, where we pay honorable mention to honorable mention Jewish Canadians who have died recently. So before we dive in, just an administrative note. The goal of the series is to honor and tell the stories of some of the greatest lights of our community, to celebrate their lives with all the joy and energy and good humor that they brought to the people around them. Now, the name of our show was a nod to covering a journalism beat, and it was meant to reflect that. But after lots of feedback, it seems the name still doesn't strike the right chord for many of you. So we're looking for suggestions, and we want your help, so please write us and give us some titles. You can get in touch with me at ebesner@thecjn.ca. And now, on with the show. I'm joined by our CJN obit writer, veteran journalist Ron Csillag. Hey, Ron, welcome back.
Thank you, Ellen. Good to be back.
It's good to be back with you. And we've lost some big names this month, as you may have already known, since you wrote some of those obituaries or heard in my in-depth podcast about some of them.
It's been usually, the summer doldrums. This wasn't one of them. You could say death does not take a holiday.
No, and it was bad.
Irving Abella passed away, as we know. Holocaust educator and author Max Eisen died. Rabbi Dow Marmur, formerly of Holy Blossom Temple, died. Clayton Ruby died on just recently, August 2nd. And so those are the big ones. There were others too, and we will get to all of them, I hope.
Yeah, we'll do a lightning round at the end for folks who recently died that people can look up online on our CJN.ca website.
And the Canadian government response was, "We regret that no country can open its doors wide enough to take in the hundreds and thousands of Jewish people who want to leave Germany. The line must be drawn somewhere. Permission to land refused."
So we need to start off with, of course, Irving Abella, because as one of the giants in Canadian Jewish life, Jewish history, in both sectors of academia as well as in politics, he was big, and his funeral was at Beth Tzedek Synagogue. Tell me a little bit about your relationship with him.
Well, I had a good relationship with him. He was always very approachable, very calm, a modest man. The only time he couldn't comment on a story to me was, for some reason, he said he couldn't because the case that I was talking about might come up before the Supreme Court. And of course, Leslie Vertes, his wife, was Justice of the Supreme Court. That would put him in a conflict. But he did give me a very good anonymous quote, so he couldn't resist, I suppose. But there aren't, I guess you could say about him, there aren't too many historians, Jewish historians, who become a household name in Canada, and he certainly was. He and Harold Troper, of course, wrote a very seminal book, None is Too Many, which has become, almost entered sort of the Jewish lexicon for shutting people out of the country. When it came out in 1982, it really made a big splash. Splashes were made even before the internet, kids. So both of them, the book absolutely shattered the myth of Canadian openness and kindness to outsiders fleeing oppression. They documented a very sorry record of Canada being one of the most exclusionary policies of any country in the world, where Jews sought refuge in the Nazi period, which was 1933 and even afterwards, after the war. We learned from them that the United States accepted 200,000 Jews between 1933 and 45. Britain was 70,000, Argentina 50,000, other countries down the line. Canada let in 5,000 Jews total. And according to them, it was only after 1948 that began to accept a significant number of Jewish refugees. So the number of 5,000 is really paltry when you consider it might have been between 1933 and 1945. So it didn't put Canada in a very good light, but it really had very real-world consequences, the book. And it seems everyone read it, and not too many people read Canadian histories, and not too many people read Canadian Jewish histories. But this was on everyone's shelf.
One very interesting thing about watching the funeral and listening to his family, he had a public persona because he was president of Canadian Jewish Congress. Mm-hmm. He was a historian. He was always sort of a public figure, as was his wife in her up-and-coming career in the legal system. But at home, he was, you could just picture the professor's house, papers on every table, and he had different things going on. He had the book called Coat of Many Colors. He had labor history books. He wrote about J.D. Salzberg. And his kids were say that there was literally no table in the house that wasn't covered with his, artifacts and papers, that he was always writing something. I really liked the fact that the kids talked about how he was a great sports fan, and basically he hated going to all these parties, and he was more happy to be home watching sports than to be at all these hoity-toity parties. It was lovely.
And a very doting parent, apparently. There was a saying in his house that the kids had two mothers, only one of them had a beard. So there you go.
So many people know none is too many, but in terms of what impact it has on our community today, what is his legacy?
Well, his legacy was best seen even before the book was published. There was a rough draft of it floating around 1979. It was, as I say, a rough draft, almost in finished form. But in any event, Joe Clark was elected prime minister. At the same time, people might remember the Vietnamese boat people, thousands of people fleeing the communist regime in Vietnam in these most rickety boats that were so easily swamped and sunk. They were washing up all over the place, including Canada. Somebody had Irving Abella and Harold Troper had the idea to send the rough draft of a book to the Ministry of Immigration. It landed on the desk of a deputy minister who showed it to a man named Ron Csillag, who's then the Minister of Immigration. Mm-hmm. And basically the message was, smacked it down on his desk, so the story was, and said, don't be this guy. The authors included a note, and the note said, we hope Canada will not be found wanting in this refugee crisis the way it was in the last one. This touched Ron Csillag deeply because he read the book and he said, no, this isn't going to be me. As he put it, the book stiffened my resolve to be bold. And what happened was the initial goal was 8,000 people a year. And by the end of 1980, it was 50,000. So obviously, this had some sort of effect on the new government of Joe Clark.
You can only realize what it means to be locked up in a camp with guards and barbed wire and electricity and all that sort of thing. So I can never forget this.
So speaking about the Holocaust, you need to talk about Max Eisen because he was in a film called The Accountant of Auschwitz, where they talked about the prosecution of a Nazi war criminal, Oscar Groening, who was an accountant at Auschwitz camp and was prosecuted and found guilty at age 96 or something. And he went to Germany with some other Toronto survivors to testify. So, first of all, I'm sure you knew Max Eisen as well, or you covered him?
I knew him and covered him. I didn't know him particularly well. But, he was one of the best Holocaust educators around and a wonderful speaker, very articulate. And kids naturally gravitated to him. They liked him. They wanted to hear him. Max wrote, as I reviewed it, my first line in my review of Max's book was, all memoirs of Holocaust survivors deserve to be read, only some are better than others. And Max's was absolutely remarkable. It's one of those books that give yourself time, go to the bathroom before because you're not putting it down. It's called By Chance Alone, a remarkable true story. And it really made waves. It was shortlisted, as we know, for the RBC Taylor Prize, and it won the 2019 CBC's Canada Reads. And it really is a no-holds-barred. He really doesn't pull his punch. Don't read it on a full stomach. It's not for the faint of heart, but do read it, because it is a absolutely hard-hitting, remarkable book that just, as I say, it doesn't look away.
Why do you think he was so able to connect with kids and in the way he spoke? He was a small man with a beautifully melodious, deep voice. Yeah. How did it? Because they're 3 or 4 generations away from this.
Yeah. I think because kids are suckers for the truth, and Max told the truth. It was unvarnished. He didn't couch it in terms. He didn't say people were killed. He said people were murdered. People's heads were crushed in. People were stomped to death. I was thrown in a ditch and left to die. These are words anybody can understand. And they had a bit of a shock value, but kids appreciated being spoken to in this way. And it wasn't just, we have to speak out against racism. It wasn't just that, because they've heard this before. When Max spoke, people listened because he was just so direct. And he didn't believe in any kind of dissembling at all. He was a natural-born teacher and a natural-born storyteller.
He was apparently, during the funeral, we learned that he'd been sick for a year. He was told, he was going to go meet his maker. He knew that at the end. And yet he was still working on a new book, which is a kid's book of his, a kid's version of his book with illustrators and everything, with a publisher. Up until quite maybe a week or two before he died. So we're looking forward to seeing what will come of that. I'm sure it will be super fly off the shelves, just as his own book did. Yeah. But even right up into the end, he had so much work to do. He wasn't ready to rest on his laurels.
Always working, always. He got several honorary doctorates, all kinds of... He got the key to the city of Vaughan. Mm-hmm. The only time I ever saw Max not get upset, but his voice modulated above the usual pleasant tones. I asked him point blank when he was being interviewed. You forget, people don't know this, but the prosecutor of Oscar Groening came to Toronto several years ago to interview people who would, what are called co-plaintiffs under German law. These are people who were there, never have met Oscar Groening, but it didn't matter. They were there to describe what daily life was like in Auschwitz. And there were 3 survivors from Toronto who participated in these tapings and these interviews. One of them was Max. Afterwards, I asked him, and he was terrific, of course, and that's why he was chosen to testify. I asked him, I said, Max, this guy is going to be sitting right across from you at the table. You're going to be in the witness stand, and he's going to be sitting right in front of you. If you had to, if you wanted to, what would you tell him? And Max got a little upset, and he said, how could you do it? How could you sit in your office and tally up not just money, but the Jews' belongings, their gold, their silver, their gold from their teeth, children's toys, everything that was taken? It was up to you to divide between the valuable and the less valuable. How could you do it? And then he went back to being approachable Max.
Well, that's the point of this film is somebody in that film, if you've ever seen the account of Auschwitz, one of the survivors forgives Oscar Groening. Mm. And that was super controversial. Yes. But Max did not, could not, would not. No. He can move on, but he could never forgive. That's what he said.
Well, he put his talents to good use.
He wanted people who were perpetrators to be prosecuted until the very last drop.
Yeah, of course.
And those who helped him, like Johnny Stevens, the black tank driver, African-American tank driver, couldn't say enough, couldn't do enough for that.
But here's the interesting final twist about Max and Oscar Groening. I also asked Max, what would you like Oscar Groening to be? He'll probably be sentenced, otherwise he wouldn't have gone through all this. What would an appropriate sentence be? Oscar Groening was then in his late 80s or early 90s. He's not going to go to jail. What are they going to do? And Max said, well, I'd be happy if he was sentenced to speak to kids for the rest of his life. Just go out there, speak to elementary school students, university students. Instead, Oscar Groening got a jail term. So they were serious. They did sentence him to, I think it was 4 years. And so I think Max was a little bit surprised by that.
I hadn't heard that before. That's actually really, really interesting. Because that would have done... He actually did come out before the whole court case, from what I remember hearing about this Oscar Groening, to say the Holocaust did happen, and he was like trying to shush the Holocaust deniers in Germany. And this is how he came to notice of the prosecutors in Germany. He was under the radar for all his life, and then he spoke out, and then because they heard him say that the Holocaust happened, he got punished. It's kind of like,
I hadn't heard that. But...
Yeah, no, that's what happened. He didn't back down. He did apologize, but he got, I guess, as the spokesperson and the scapegoat for everybody, right?
Well, Max lived a long and very, very fulfilling life.
He did, and his legacy is huge.
If in my own lifetime, if I think where we were and where we are, both as a Jewish people, as a society, or as Canada, as a Jewish state, or whatever, there is much room for optimism. And
one of the community's major losses this summer has been, of course, the loss of Holy Blossom Rabbi Dow Marmur, who died in Israel. I did not know him, but of course I read his columns all the time in the Canadian Jewish News, as did hundreds of people, thousands of people, I'm sure. Yeah,
another very approachable man. Anytime I called, he would speak to me for long or for short. He had big shoes to fill. He came after Gunther Plaut, and he filled them admirably. He was a very respected scholar. He was an activist, known for a certain speaking style and for being very on time about everything. Interesting life. He had an accent that came from nowhere, according to his daughter. But he was born in Poland, and then he was 87 when he died. The family with him went to Siberia, Uzbekistan, back to Poland. He spoke at survivor conferences, and he considered himself one, and he was considered one. Of course, he did a lot of interesting things at Holy Blossom.
For people who may not know or not from Toronto, Holy Blossom is a very large Reform congregation in Toronto.
It's Canada's largest Reform temple. Under Rabbi Marmur's guidance, Holy Blossom established the Out of the Cold program, which was controversial at first. It wasn't welcome. People were kind of wary of having the homeless sleep right in the temple, on the floors or on cots or wherever they could. But he welcomed them, and now Holy Blossom is a point of pride. Or rather, the Out of the Cold program is a point of pride for Holy Blossom. In a more controversial vein, in the early 80s, when the AIDS epidemic was raging, Rabbi Marmur and a team of women at Holy Blossom got to work. They established support networks for people living or dying of AIDS and for their loved ones. They raised funds for medical care, funeral costs, and so on, and for a very famous Third Seder, which had its own Haggadah. And so, he had a little saying, you thought you were getting an English gentleman, but what you got was a Polish Jew, which he got both. That's what I like to remember him by. And it was also quite an ardent Zionist.
First job I had was as a host in a Chinese restaurant that was in the exhibition. I figured out a long time ago that if you're going to practice law, that dazzle was good, but it was not nearly enough.
Now, I know we're running out of time, but we must give honorable mention to Clayton Ruby, big giant in the legal field in Canada, Jewish lawyer, for the downtrodden, the oppressed, the marginalized, big cases.
Yeah, a giant of the Canadian Civil Liberties Bar. Had all kinds of high-profile cases, including Henry Morgentaler, which I have a feeling he represented with alongside Morris Manning. But he represented Guy Paul Morin, who was falsely accused of murder, as we know. Also a woman named Michelle Douglas, who was a gay soldier, and the federal court, reversed that and ordered basically the armed forces to end its discriminatory policy against LGBTQ folks in the armed forces. So he also represented Sven Robinson in a very high-profile case in this medically assisted death of Sue Rodriguez. And in the end, Robinson wasn't charged in the case. So
Robinson is a former member of
Parliament. Member of Parliament, right. So, interesting man, very committed to social justice and to civil liberties causes. Clayton Ruby was loudly and proudly on the left, but what he could not abide was the left's constant attacks on Israel. And he really found that a horrible double standard. And he called them out on it in a very, very good article in the Globe and Mail several years ago. He said that leftists have a right and an obligation to denounce anti-Semitism. That includes the debate about Israel and Palestine. He said he rejected as anti-Semitic the shameful double standard applied only to Israel. We call on the Canadian left as a whole to reject this double standard as well. So he could be on the left and still support Israel.
I put the past behind me. I have to work and see what I can do for myself. And I work hard, I learn, I study, and I bring myself up. And I see my whole tragic story is a successful story.
Now, we do have to mention several other people. We've had all guys on today, so we need to do an honorable mention. The community lost a Hungarian Holocaust speaker, Holocaust survivor in Montreal. These are all Montrealers now from the next couple. Leslie Vertes.
Yeah.
I hope I said it right.
Well, I'll say it Hungarian style, and that was Leslie Vertes, or if you really want to get Hungarian, Vertes Laci, who was a remarkable man, 97, I believe. And followed his lifespan sort of followed a standard one for Hungarian Jewish men. He was in a forced labor battalion, but then he escaped from the forced labor battalion, went into hiding, and had several hair-raising near misses. Survived the war until the Soviet liberation in January of 1945. Thought he was in the clear. Instead, he was deported to a Soviet prisoner of war camp in Ukraine, where he almost died several times, didn't come back to Hungary until January of 1947, and that's really when his life began.
And lastly, of course, Mr. Hollywood North, Mel Hoppenheim, also a Montrealer, passed away. We have an obit as well in the CJN.ca. And Mel Hoppenheim was basically the impresario and film producer and movie mogul, but he almost wasn't. He almost was in the meat business.
He was in the meat business, but here's the thing about him. And what happened was many years ago, he found himself on a shoot of a commercial near Mont-Tremblant, and he was speaking to some of the production people who lamented the fact that all their equipment had to come from the United States. Nothing was available in Canada. And of course, the proverbial light bulb went off over his head. Long story short, he ended up making available to shoots in Canada everything people needed in terms of equipment, cameras, dollies, the whole thing. And he built up something called Mel's Cité de Cinéma into the largest provider of services to film and TV in the country. He was known as you said, Mr. Hollywood North. He attracted a lot of U.S. foreign investment. And very generous philanthropist, Jewish General Hospital, Siegel Center for the Performing Arts, the Israeli Film Festival, the list went on, and an Order of Canada to boot. So,
honorable mention. And we have three just to say, we send our condolences out, of course, to two Second World War veterans. I knew both of them. I've written about them. We've written about them in the CJN. Norman Cash passed away at the age of 103 in Toronto. He was on the commercials for Remembrance Day that Bell Canada filmed with this little girl that met him selling poppies. He used to sell poppies all the time. And Mickey Heller passed away. He was a Second World War RCAF veteran. And he's the subject of several articles by his grandson, Aaron Heller, who's a former Associated Press and New York Times writer, about his role with the Machalniks in 1948, and the Jews who served in the Second World War and then went over to Israel to help Israel during the War of Independence. So Mickey Heller passed away. He just turned 100, and you can read about him in the CJN as well. And Nick Nemiroff, comedian, passed away. Again, all this is on our website. So that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily's Dead Beat, sponsored by Metropia, Integrity, Community, Quality, and Customer Care. Ron, thanks so much again for all your insights. A great conversation.
Pleasure.
And we're going to ask the audience, please send us in your suggestions for our next episode for who we should give honorable mention to. And also, if you have a better name than we have come up with, here's a couple that our producer suggested. What do you think of The Jewish Goodbye? Yay, nay? How about Unveiled? Nah. That's okay. And Chevrei Kadisha. That's clever, but it's hard to say. So again, thanks so much for listening on the CJN Daily. Special thanks to Barry Shanebaum for the audio of the late Rabbi Dow Marmur, and to Toronto Life magazine for Clayton Ruby's clip, and to the Azrieli Foundation for Leslie Vertes.